Howdy everyone. For today's Jolly Lark, I'm going to be tackling this big new model from Parabellum, the Rakshasa. It's this really cool four-armed tiger giant, and it is big. Conquest models are 38 millimeter scale to start with compared to kind of normal 28 to 32 millimeter size. So when you have a giant Conquest model, it is big. If you've caught some of my other videos, I've also painted one of the big kind of Brontosaurus Tantor monsters for the Wadroon and the Siegebreaker Behemoth miniature for the Spires faction. And this Rakshasa Tiger Giant is for the new Sorcerer Kings faction. In this video, I'm going to focus on how to paint the furry skin because that's what really sets this model apart, but I'll quickly run through the other steps as well so that you can follow along if you're painting your own tiger giant. Now, something that's different about this model is that it comes with three different alternate heads. You've got kind of a demon head and kind of a more human-looking head, and they've also got what I think is cool is this tiger head. It's like if you put a tiger head on your giant, put a tiger head on the giant. But it means that the skin isn't sculpted to be fuzzy, furry tiger skin because there's just the one body option. So you put a tiger head on the more human body. I wanted the skin to have a little more fuzzy, textured, furred look to match the tiger head. So hopefully this is a technique that you find interesting, that you find useful, and that you can use anytime you want to add kind of a furred texture to otherwise smooth skin. So what I'm doing here, I've kind of been showing a little bit of the footage as I'm talking, and what I'm doing here to start with is I've got a black base coat. I'm just grabbing a little bit of ripped up makeup sponge, and you want the dense. There's two different types of makeup sponges. One is a little denser, kind of sometimes sold as a premium makeup sponge, which is like $3 versus $1. So I've got just a little bit of ripped up makeup sponge, and I'm putting on some dark gray blue, and I'm just kind of putting this all over the areas of the skin, just kind of sponging it on, and you can see what it's doing there is adding kind of a dappled, textured base coat that's still leaving a little bit of black in the deepest cracks and crevices, but it's just starting to texture the skin area with a little bit of that kind of dark gray blue undertone. The goal here is to end up with a white tiger skin, kind of going Siegfried and Roy style with this. I thought that would really, this is going to be a big centerpiece model. White is attention getting. And because I've got a bunch of Fire Djinnis in the army, I didn't want to do orange tiger skin because I feel like the Fire Djinnis, if you saw the video on those, check it out, with the fluorescent orange Fire Djinnis, they kind of have a monopoly on orange in this army. So white tiger it is. And so kind of putting down this dark blue to be the kind of the base shadow color for the white. But if you were going for any other fur color, whether or not brown fur, gray fur, orange fur, whatever, just pick your shadow color appropriately, something that's a darker tone of where you're eventually going to end up. So speaking of big, just thought I'd grab a model real quick, show you the scale of this model compared to a standard 32 size model. This dude is big. So for the next step, I'm going to grab a little bit lighter color, in this case just a little bit lighter, kind of gray, bluish gray, and I'm going to continue to use the sponge texture to build up the texture on the skin, because the impression we want to give is of texture. The key to doing this quickly and to painting not making yourself go crazy, trying to paint in tens of thousands of little individual hair brushstrokes or something, is to get the surface to look textured and then actually add the hair texture as kind of a final finishing step. And that'll give the impression of a furry surface without actually, you don't have to paint every single layer of color in a fur texture. If you have a textured look overall, you can just kind of add the hair lines, the brush strokes that actually create the hair texture at the end. We've used a bluish gray so far, but that's going to be for the shadow areas, and shadows do tend to have a bluer, cooler color. The light that falls into the shadows of things is reflected from the sky, and so has that same kind of blue tones as the sky, whereas the light that's direct sunlight has a more warmer yellow tones. So the goal here is to have this look like a white tiger, not a light blue tiger. So with this next stage of color, we're going to switch from the cool blue tones of the first two colors we've used. And I'm going to mix up kind of a grayish khaki color by mixing a bone color and a neutral gray color to create a warm, lighter gray. You can see me mixing on my parchment paper down there. And I generally do this, I'm doing this on dry parchment paper. Parchment paper is plasticized, so it makes a good surface to put paint on top of because it doesn't soak up any of the moisture of the paint. But when I'm doing sponge painting, I don't want the paint to be too wet and gloopy or too runny. So I tend to just mix up a little batch on the parchment paper and then work from there. It's fine to use the same sponge. You get a little bit of blue in it. That's fine. And basically doing the same thing that we did before, but just with every stage going a little bit lighter. I'm barely putting any pressure on the model at this point. So this light bone gray is just being deposited on the raised surfaces of the muscles here. And you can really see how you're starting to build up a color that is going to get us to white fur. To continue with that, we're going to now go back to the same bone color that we mixed with gray in the previous stage. And I'm going to add to that just a little bit of the golden open thinner. This is just my preferred clear medium. It extends the drying time of the paint a little bit without changing the texture too much. It's the clear medium that I've found that I feel like is the closest in consistency to hobby paint straight out of the bottle. Kind of thin without being too watery, and some of the other clear mediums can be a little on the thicker, toothpastier side. So the golden open thinner, that's my current favorite clear medium. So just mixing that, maybe 1 part medium to 2 parts paint. That's going to give us a bone color that is a little bit translucent, which will let us do multiple layers of it without getting too harsh. Just cutting it with a little bit of the clear medium will give each brushstroke a little bit of translucency, and then we'll be able to layer those on more to get the effect we're looking for. And so here's where we're starting to actually add some of the actual fur texture. Now, I wouldn't want to do this all over a whole army. I wouldn't want to do this on, all the skin of every single model, but just kind of a slow, steady progress of making some little straight, thin strokes on the raised areas of the model. And you'll start to see you're building up that sort of hair fur texture using these sponge-on layers, which are much faster to do, as the base texture. And really just this top layer is where the individual hairs are going to be visible. You don't necessarily have to use the world's greatest brush for this or anything. In fact, if the tips of the brush is a little bit splayed, or your tip actually has, the tip of your brush is actually 2 or 3 tips, that's sometimes okay here. That it can create a little bit more texture. If you're putting down 1 or 2 lines per, 3 lines per brushstroke, that's fine. And you can really see in this close-up here, I was not neat and clean with the sponging. I've got the blue-gray all over everything. It's, it's on the shoulder pads, it's on the armor. It doesn't matter at all. That's going to get covered up in a future stage. And that's all part of the inside-out painting method that I prefer doing, where you're painting the innermost areas first, because it's just so much easier to paint neatly when you're painting something that's on top of another surface. So skipping past about 20 minutes of putting light tan furry texture all over the model, which is not that bad for a singular model that's going to be a centerpiece of the army. 20 minutes of little teeny lines, that's fine. But we're moving on to the final stage of the fur here, which is to take some actual white mixed with the same golden open thinner and a little bit thinner brush, and just adding in a little bit of white hairiness, some very fine white lines on top of those bone lines from earlier. And this is going to give the fur kind of the final pop and make it look like white. And this is true whether or not you're painting white cloth or white fur or whatever, that you're going to have your brightest color be white. You can't go brighter than white. So if you want it to look like white fur, you have to stop with white. You can't highlight it to something brighter than white. And you just have to keep that in mind the whole time you're painting and building up the colors that are going underneath white. And I think that this transition from the black primer and the deepest recesses where the sponge didn't reach, 2 shades of gray, the bone, and then the white is a pretty good white fur effect. One thing you may notice I'm doing here is on each kind of muscle group, on each bulge of the muscles, I'm taking some of the white lines and having them kind of come out from the center of the gray area so that there's almost like a subtle starburst pattern, but I don't have all the lines going in exactly the same direction. I was looking at my dog before I did this painting and kind of noticed that her fur, she has very short fur, it doesn't all shoot, not every single hair on her body is parallel to each other. The hairs kind of radiate outward from the big muscle groups. So trying to recreate that here a little bit. And so like from that ridge of the muscle, the hair is then kind of coming down from the uppermost portion, if that makes sense. Now, the real final step for the fur is to put the tiger stripes on. And I have never done tiger stripes on a model before, so doing that while I'm also recording for a video, I wasn't 100% sure how this was going to turn out, but I grabbed kind of a thin, fine brush, pulled up a reference picture of a tiger's back, and just kind of went to town, which is fine, It's just paint. If you're really unhappy with something, you can always start over and do it again. Paint goes on pretty thin. You can always prime over something. And if you really don't like something right after you put it on, you can always smap some water and usually wipe off the paint. It's not actually dry for about 5 minutes or so. So it's relatively easy to erase mistakes if you don't like how something turned out. Now, those of you who are familiar with the original Conquest model for the Rakshasa will notice that normally on this model, as it's pictured on the official version of the model, there's a giant pile of flames on top of the model's back. I didn't love the look of that. It's fine, it's cool, but I really wanted the flames to be focused on my flame genies in the army. And I was really happy to see when I got the model that the back is pretty much fully sculpted. There's a couple little pits where the fire bit is meant to plug in, but those were really easy to fill with just a little bit of green stuff, let it dry, sand it down. I'm not much of a green stuff sculptor, and those couple little holes were really easy to fill. Painting these tiger stripes is really a great example of why a reference photo is sometimes useful. I would 100% not have painted the tiger stripes this way if I hadn't been looking at a tiger. They would have had less breaks in them. There would have been fewer of them. They probably would have been wider, and I might have ended up with something that was a little bit like a cartoon version of tiger stripes. But working from the reference picture that I have on my phone down there really helped to get kind of some of the shapes and irregularities that I wouldn't have remembered were there if I was just painting them from my flawed memory of what a tiger looks like. So don't be afraid to use reference photos if you're trying to make something look like something from the real world. So that's the fur pretty much done, and the model doesn't really look like that much right now because the fur is only a relatively small part of the surface area, but that's okay. What we're going to do, I'm going to kind of breeze through some of the next steps pretty quickly so that if you are painting a Rakshasa of your own, you can follow along. It seemed like the fur was the thing that was maybe a little different than what some people are used to painting, but there's useful stuff here, and in general, like I said before, just kind of following that inside out philosophy of painting the skin level stuff first and then painting everything else kind of going outwards. Now, painting the inside of the mouth is actually a little bit of a reverse of that because the inside of the mouth I would often actually do before the skin, but you also have to know, you kind of have to do messy to neat. And I knew that sponge painting layer was going to be really messy and get all over the inside of the mouth. So I wanted to get that done first, if that makes sense. I'm just grabbing a little bit of a solid pink, painting the tiger's nose. That little pink nose becomes a nice focal point of the face, and then painting the interior of the mouth entirely in this kind of light pink, trying to leave a little bit of black left in the cracks between the gums and the white fur. Put a little dot of bright blue into the eyes. It seems like a lot of white tigers have light blue eyes. Just kind of painting the whole pupil there with a light blue. To start the horns, I'm going to paint those in a pretty traditional way and just put on kind of a warm brown. Give them an all-over base coat of the warm brown to get those started. While we're at it, it's nice to use the same colors for multiple things. That speeds up painting, gets everything done a little bit faster than doing each element separately. So with the warm brown out and wet on the palette, go ahead and do a base coat of the warm brown on all of the teeth in the mouth and all the fingernails and toenails, which this model has a lot of. Because this model is part of an army project, I'm going to do the cloth in a similar kind of blended jade colors that I did on the cloth for the Flame Djinnis. I'll put a link down below to that video as well if you want to see that done in a little bit more detail. It's also the same color combination I used on my Cthulhu Cultists. I liked it so much on the Cultists, I brought it into this army project, which often happens. You know, you're inspired by one project, you like something, and you want to do more of it. I think it's actually the Cultist video that has it in the most detail, so check out the Flame Djinnis if you're interested in the Sorcerer Kings. Check out the Cultists if you want to see how I'm using these colors to highlight cloth. Now, I wanted some of that turquoise cloth on this model to pull it into the rest of the army, which I think is important when you're doing an army project. But you can see I'm also going to do some purple on some of the cloth to really make this centerpiece model pop out. Now, having base coated the two different colors of cloth and the horns and the inside of the mouth and the tongue and all, I'm going to go back now and base coat all the metallics in the Vallejo Dark Bronze, which is going to be my primary metallic color for this army. You can go part by part, highlighting and shading each part. I think it tends to be a little bit faster if you base coat one area and then while that's drying, go on and base coat your next areas. Once all your base coats are done, the model's ready for a game at that point, and then it's up to you to decide how much more work you want to put into it. And here we are with the whole model basically base coated, and you can see from this image that obviously a little more work has gone into the fur that we did first, but everything else is just base coated. It looks okay. You could finish the base and throw this on the tabletop. It's a cool model. The base coats make it's finished, at this point. But with just a little bit more kind of basic highlighting and shading, can make bring the whole model up to the same level. And that tends to be what you want to do. Totally fine to have a model that's base coated with no highlighting, no shading. A painted army is a painted army. But if you're going to highlight and shade some of the model, you probably want to go ahead and do the whole thing. So here, just doing a super quick bit of the Vulpus Pink contrast paint on all of the pink of the tongue and the gums. That'll add a little bit of a purpley pinkish shading to those. And that's a quick and easy to get that done. It's very, very common. It's very popular these days to see contrast paints being used over the black and white zenithal highlighting, but it's good to keep in mind that it's just fine to use them over a solid base coat. A pink magenta wash looks great on top of a solid pink base coat. You don't have to do it over a zenithal highlight. So since you're still here, I appreciate it. If you're still watching up to this point, that's great. A lot of people, drop out after the first couple of minutes of a video. I just include a little bit of this quick blending that I'm doing, which big models like this are a great place to practice. You just lay in a little bit of the brightest color and get a brush full of either water or that open medium that I was using earlier. And you can just use that to kind of feather out that bright color into the clear medium. It's a good way to get some kind of quick and easy blends from light to dark. And putting down that dark base coat first gives you kind of a surface to work on top of to do that. That basic wet blending technique is a great thing to practice when you're working on a larger model, to just put a little bit of the lighter color on top of the darker, kind of in a stripe like that, wipe off your brush, and you've just got a little bit of paint left on your brush, then kind of use that little bit of paint that's left on your brush just to smooth that light color kind of down and out into the darker color. You can hit all the metallics with good old Agrax Earthshade. It's just a nice way to darken all the cracks and crevices of the metal a little bit. Generally a good idea to do a darkening wash before you do any highlights. That way your highlights are nice and as bright as possible. And I'm going to do this over the silver and the bronze. Kind of works equally well for both. I also like Targor Rage Shade for this. Either one works well. Targor Rage Shade is a little more red. Agrax Earth Shade is a little more of a true brown. Either one works, and I generally prefer both of them to Nuln Oil. Black can have a little bit of too much black on a model can have a little bit of a dulling effect on it, I think. And like my high school art teacher always said, use as little black as possible. So use some. It's certainly not never. But I do tend to not use black in my washes. To highlight the metal, once the wash is fully dried, of course, I'm going to use the new Turbo Dork 2 cents copper paint. I think this is the most vibrant, shiniest copper paint I've ever used. I really, really like it as a color. I've used it in a couple different projects now. And because the metallic paints are already somewhat reflective, and that reflectivity provides a little bit of, highlighting, so to speak, because it's reflecting the light that's shining on the model, I tend to go kind of Spartan, kind of spare with the highlights on the metals, just little pops and ridges, the corners and edges, and let the reflectivity of the base layer, going to let the shininess of the base layer provide most of the highlights, and just use this bright copper as like a little sparkle on the edges and the tips and the points. And I think it results in a really nice effect. I've gotten a lot of nice comments about the copper effect at the local game store, and it's really it's striking on the tabletop. It's a little easier to see in videos than in photos where the model is moving around. But this copper paint really has a true metallic reflectivity that looks just great in person. If you haven't tried out the new Turbo Dork reformulated paints, really highly recommended. I've used a few of their colors now and liked all of them. They're the ones with the bigger, fatter bottles with the big fat black caps. Is how you can tell the difference between the old formulas and the new formulas. The old ones were really designed to be used through an airbrush, and the new reformulated paints work just fine with a regular brush. For the sword blades, I've done them just kind of in a basic silver color scheme, kind of a dark silver with a light silver highlights, and I've dropped a little bit of white ink into the magic runes on the swords, as you can see here, and I'm going to just give the silver a little bit of a highlight while I'm waiting on that ink to dry, and that white ink can then be the base coat for putting some transparent yellow and red paints into the runes and giving it a little bit of a glow, magical glow to it. Contrast paints are great for that. Any transparent paints, proacryl transparent paints would work for this too. I'm just going to put a little bit of the transparent yellow into the rune, and because it is transparent, I want a little bit of the contrast yellow. Most of the contrast paints are pretty transparent. And because it's transparent, it'll flow into the cracks, and if it gets a little bit into the raised surfaces, if you get a little bit of the yellow onto the silver, that's fine. It's just going to look like the yellow is casting a little bit of yellow light onto the silver. And what I'm going to do is, while this yellow is still wet, I'm just going to take a teeny little bit of the red paint, and in the middle, where the yellow is still a little bit wet, I'm just going to drop in a little bit of this red, wipe my brush off, and then with a little bit more yellow, use a little bit more yellow to just kind of smoosh the edges of the red out using kind of the wet on wet contrast paints. And generally, you don't want to wet blend contrast paints. They tend to dry, and they kind of will pull apart a little bit if you're touching them too much when they're wet. But for a little bit like this, in a little bit of a furrow, it'll be just fine. I wouldn't use contrast paints to wet blend a cloth or cloak or something, but just a little trough like so, you can get a little transition between red and yellow that I think looks pretty good on the sword. Red is a pretty powerful color. It's kind of can easily overpower yellow. So you just make sure you're just using a tiny little bit of red to mix in with the yellow. Now this is a 4-armed giant. There's 4 of these swords. There's runes on both sides of the swords, but I'm going to basically do a similar effect on all the runes on all the swords. So let's skip ahead to the next step. And the next step is the final step. We'll give the base a nice solid coat of the Vallejo earth. Then we're going to do a pretty heavy dry brush of the Vallejo khaki. And then we will finish up the base with another lighter dry brush of the ivory bone color. And the base is made just using a mixture of the Jolly Lark Rocky Boulders basing texture that's sold on the Jolly Lark website. They're the basic basing grit with a little sprinkle of the coarse basing grit. So with those 3 different basing textures applied with some PVA glue, it's really easy to create a very, variegated, interesting base with just some basic textures. Stick some tufts on there if you want or not. But I'm kind of going for a rocky desert look for this army. So I think I'm just going to leave it with the grit and the rocks for now. Maybe I'll be inspired to stick some tufts on later. There we go. His big guy all wrapped up. Some really cool model. I'm looking forward to getting him on the tabletop. Just terrific sculpt from Parabellum. The new Sorcerer Kings army just is knocking it out of the park. So hopefully you found that useful. I really appreciate you watching all the way to the end. It's even better if you leave a comment below, or if you have a question, or just say you like the video. Subscribing is great. Big shout out, big thank you to 3,000 subscribers. That's awesome. Really happy with the success of the channel so far. But more is always better. So, tell your friends and come back for our next Jolly Lark.